In the previous lesson, we examined in more detail the kinds of policies that had been implemented by Alexander III. Specifically, we focused on the crackdown and the enforcement of autocracy within the state, essentially trying to break away from some of the mistakes that his father had committed. And we also talked about the policy of Russification, the policy that ultimately led to the cracking down of essentially any kind of difference and divergence in culture and identity that takes place in the Russian state, with the enforcement of a unified language, the enforcement of a unified religion, and then ultimately and unfortunately the instantiation and the systemic instantiation of anti-Semitism within the Russian state. In this lesson, we are going to talk about society and the economy. We're going to focus mainly on economic reforms that take place under Alexander III. We'll talk about some of the major financial ministers who contributed to this particular set of reforms, and then we will talk about some of the societal conditions that changed as well. So let's think about economic reforms first. In 1862, we have the Minister of Finance, Mikhail von Rayton, being made the Minister of Finance. And what Rayton would do would be serving as Minister of Finance for quite a long period of time under the reign of Alexander III. He would reign for, or at least be serving as Minister of Finance between 1862 and 1878. And while he was Minister of Finance, he introduced a series of economic reforms. Now, we're going to assess whether or not these reforms were successful in a second, but these reforms included things like the abolition of tax farming, the treasury being reformed with the establishment of new audit systems to essentially audit the kind of financial decisions that had been made. We also see the establishment and the making of credit facilitation through the establishment of banks. So with the establishment of banks, people can then be able to withdraw on credit, and this can lead to essentially the loaning of revenue. We also see government guaranteed annual dividends, which were provided for foreign investors. All of these things were introduced as financial reforms to the Russian state economy in order to bolster and improve some of the economic conditions that had existed during this period. In terms of the assessment, in terms of examining whether or not these reforms were particularly successful, we can note that there are for and against in terms of the implementation of some of these policies, which is very useful for anybody who is writing an essay on this particular issue. When you have an issue, you're asked to assess, for example, the economic reforms under Alexander III, you can talk about some of the pros and cons of some of the implementation of these policies. On the one hand, we see improvements to various industries that were relatively important for the Russian Empire. So we see cotton and mining industries improving, for example, as well as improvements that were made to agriculture and agricultural development. One of the reasons for this was the abolition of tax farming. On the other hand, we see transport and labour mobility being relatively limited. So obviously labour being a very important mode of production and one of the important sources of revenue, with a lacking of labour mobility, a limitation of such, it meant that it was more difficult for labour to move around the state into the most economically effective areas. In addition to this, there were also financial issues that had related to the currency itself. So the Russian currency experienced instability during the period of Alexander III. Now, an unstable currency is no good for anybody, but is especially not good for any foreign investor. It disincentivizes foreign investors to invest in that currency and to purchase in reserves of that currency, owing to the fact that we don't know what value that currency is going to be at a certain point in time. People tend to often go for the currencies that are the strongest, and by strongest, we are often referring to the stability of currencies. And so the volatility of currencies, an increasingly volatile currency, is difficult to essentially justify when it comes to investments that are being made. In terms of further economic reforms, we have to also think about Ivan Evergransky, who essentially was appointed the Minister of Finance in 1887, so following that of Rayton. And he served as Minister of Finance from 1887 to 1892, so all the way to the end of Alexander III's reign. While he was in office, we see further economic policies being introduced. So, for example, we see import tariffs being cut by as much as 30%, and we also see the import tariffs were actually increased to up to 30%. And the reason for this was, of course, this idea of protectionism. The idea here is that you want to boost production in industries at home, and one of the things to do that is to disincentivize the import of products from other states. And if you add a 30% tariff on those products, then that makes it very, very difficult, or at least it disincentivizes people to import those goods from abroad, and rather to rely on the production of those goods at home. It's known as protectionism, to protect your own industries. We also see an increase in grain exports by forcing peasants to sell grain to the state, and then this therefore leads to a greater economic revenue as a result of that, because we're increasing the export of grains out of the state. And then we also see another implementation of economic reform, which is, of course, the achievement of loans from abroad. And just like with the reforms that were introduced by Rayton, we have to think about this as an assessment, and we think about this in terms of the pros and cons of all of these policies. Well, when we're talking about grain exports, because of the fact that peasants were forced to sell grain to the state, it meant that we did see an increase of nearly 20% in the export of grain between 1881 and 1891. So an 18% increase between 1881 and 1891. This was problematic to an extent on the one hand for peasants, but what was more problematic for peasants was the fact that they had suffered from heavy taxation, which had economic benefits for the state on the one hand, but didn't have the economic benefits that you would want for the peasants themselves. In addition to this, we also see environmental factors causing problems. So between 1891 and 1892, we see a famine which had caused bad harvests, which led to the deaths of around 350,000 people owing to starvation and malnourishment. Again, we see as a result of this the dismissal of this finance minister as the result of the fact that this famine had caused the deaths of so many individuals. We also see, and I mentioned this earlier on, the introduction of further reforms made to agricultural practices. And this relates to land and agriculture. This was because peasants had too little land, and the biggest landowners in Russia were mainly noblemen, many of which sold off some of their lands to pay debts. Remember, when we had the introduction of the edict under the reign of Alexander II, we see the allotment of newly freed serfs with a certain amount of land, but one of the criticisms was that some of these individuals did not get enough land to even live on them. And we still have the problem of the fact that the biggest landowners in Russia were still members of the aristocracy, members of the nobility. In terms of the peasantry, richer peasants began to form into this new class that brought up land, and these were known as the kulaks. And we're going to come back to the kulaks when we talk about the policies that were implemented against them and against their private ownership of land through collectivization under the reign, in inverted commas, of Joseph Stalin. These kulaks also employed poorer peasants to work on their land, so it very much became a situation where a new, growing, almost middling class between that of the peasantry and the upper echelons of the peasantry began to formulate, and this is the introduction of the kulaks.